Want to see how I created a beautiful but easy background for my bold magnolia blooms? Hi, my name is Tony and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll be showing you how to put a relatively uncommon twist on a basic card making technique to create a stunning background. This will take your handmade card to the next level by adding texture and dimension. So let's dive in. So let's first look at the supplies we'll be using. I'm using an A2 card base and a same A2 card panel for all the ink blending I'll be doing. And the A2 card panel is of course 4 1/4 inch by 5.5 inch. I will be using this absolutely stunning Altenew stencil, which is called the Deco Wallpaper, and that's the design we'll get at the end. And I'm using the Altenew Build-a-Garden set called Blushing Magnolias that has a stamp set and a matching stencil set. And I'll be using the sentiment from that stamp set and these 3 crisp dye inks in Dewdrops, Galactic Stream, and Persian Blue. I'll be adding more inks later, but let's look at these blending brushes from Altenew, which I'll be using for ink blending, and also the Altenew Stamp Wheel Low Tack Sticky Mat. That has absolutely changed the way I do ink blending because I can stick the paper down on the mat, the sticky mat, which is actually low tack, and then I can stick the stencil right over the paper and onto the grid mat, which is going to hold the stencil securely in its place, and I won't even need to hold it down or anything like that. So I'm just taking my time to line up the design as I want, and I am sticking the stencil down onto the mat, and you can already see the tackiness of that mat, and I can easily ink blend over it and nothing's going to shift. So I'm going in with the first ink, which is Persian Blue, and I'm going to start at the corner, and I normally just tap off the brush a little bit on the stencil itself, because if I tap it off on paper or onto my work surface, I end up losing that ink and it's a waste. So I like to tap it off on the stencil so it sits on the stencil, and then I can use that ink and blend it back into the card panel, if you know what I mean. And if you are seeing splotchy or blotchy ink blending here, please know that the Altenew inks are fantastic and they will smooth out once it dries. So that's why I'm not too worried, but I'm trying to make sure that I am coming in as evenly as possible so that when I blend in the next ink, the transition is as smooth as it can be. So I'm tapping off the excess ink on the stencil itself, and that way I can blend the ink back onto the card panel without wasting any of it. And now I'll just wipe off the excess ink with my microfiber cloth so I don't contaminate the next ink pad. And I'm coming in here with Galactic Stream, and you can see that it's really splotchy over here. So I'm going to come in, tap off the ink on the stencil, and continue blending as best as I can. And I don't even need to hold on to the stencil, so that's a lot of energy saved. I'll come in with the Galactic Stream and make that transition a little bit smoother by blending over the previous Persian Blue. And then I'll come in again with the Persian Blue, the residual ink that was on my blending brush, and blend that out even further. So you see the transition looks a little bit smoother, and I rub off the Galactic Stream mix with the Persian Blue onto my rag and make sure that I'm not contaminating the ink pad. The last one is Dewdrops, which is the lightest ink. So I'm going to have to come in really heavy with this. And of course, trying to remember to remove all the excess ink on the stencil, because mixing the darker colors with the Dewdrop is going to create a completely different shade of blue that I possibly may not even like. So And by the way, I'm starting way above the transition line each time I come in with a different color, because starting close to the transition line, obviously I'm going to get my blending brush inky with the other color, and that is not going to create a good blend. And here I decided to smoosh some ink onto my glass mat and use my blending brush to pick up the ink from the glass mat instead of going into the ink pad, because as I blend over the galactic stream, it's definitely going to pick up the galactic stream, and I didn't want to transfer it back onto the light blue ink pad. I'm okay with the transition, but I'm going to come in again with galactic stream and blend over the little patches that I'm noticing there, and also use that to smooth over the previous transition line between the Persian blue and the galactic stream. I'm happy enough with this, although the dewdrop does seem a little bit light, but it looks pretty gorgeous. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I'll wipe off the excess ink again from the stencil and then lift off the stencil very carefully. I do see a bit of a splotchiness over there, but I love how gorgeous this looks. The 3 different shades of blue is just stunning, and I just removed the card panel from the sticky mat by folding it back on itself. That way I don't have to yank the card panel off. And I'm cleaning it all up with some rubbing alcohol, because it's going to allow the stencil to dry really quickly, because now is where I'm going to put a bit of a twist on the stencil technique. I'm going to replace it back onto the card panel, line it up really well, stick it down with some washi tape. And I am using that washi tape just to secure the stencil to the paper. I realized that the ink was wet. That's why the washi tape wasn't really sticking. But I'm being very careful as I flip it over and applying washi tape to the reverse side, because I want the card panel to be held securely to the stencil, because I'm going to now use the stencil to emboss that pattern over the ink blended background. I'm going to remove the washi tape in the front a little bit later when I run it through the die cutting machine, because if I leave it there, the washi tape is going to get impressed onto that paper, which obviously I don't want, because that's not where it belongs. So here is my Platinum 6 die cutting and embossing machine. I'm going to use this now to emboss that pattern with that stencil onto the background. This is a brand new machine and I'm still getting used to it. So I'm figuring out the embossing sandwich for use without an embossing folder, because I'm using only the stencil. And I am carefully removing the washi tape that is not meant to be there. And I am going to go ahead and place the adapter plate over it. So if you're using a different embossing and die cutting machine, please check your manufacturer's instructions for the correct sandwich, because it may not be the same. And here is the moment of truth. I'm going to carefully lift off and remove the washi tape. But as I was removing it, I realized that it kind of tore over. When I tried to remove the torn bit, the paper started dripping. So I just let it be, because no one's going to see the reverse side of the panel. But the washi tape came off pretty easily on this side. And make sure you pull the washi tape at an angle. And I know you can't really see it that well on camera, but there is a very subtle texture on that pattern, and it's absolutely beautiful. The pattern is especially visible on the lighter blue, and also on the reverse side you can see the pattern there. But yeah, in real life, in person, it's absolutely beautiful. So right now I'm going to come in and do some stamping with the Build-a-Garden set. I will use the bold floral design, and of course there are 3 flowers, but I'm going to use the biggest one actually, because I want to make sure that it covers the entire card panel. So I'm trying out the different sizes here, but definitely I needed to bring the actual card base in and make sure that I have the measurements in a way that it looks nice, but the background doesn't look too cluttered. So I decided to settle on the largest flower because those would be too small. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing how I catalog and index my stamps, I'll leave the link in the description and you can go and watch that video. I'm also going to use the stencil, but right now I just picked up the stamp in my stamp positioner tool and rubbing it with my fingers because this is the first time I'm using the stamp, and the photopolymer stamps always have a bit of a residue which is a little sticky on the stamps, so it's best to remove it so you get a nice and clean impression. Here I brought in more inks. I am using the Altenew Jet Black ink for the stamp outline, and I find that the Jet Black really gives a fantastic and crisp outline to my photopolymer stamps, especially the ones from Altenew. So I tend to use that over any other ink that I have. I have a couple of other black inks, but I prefer the Altenew Jet Black. I'm stamping multiple times so I get a nice crisp outline of the image. And while I'm at it, I wanted to stamp out the sentiment as well. That's the sentiment I'm going to be using. So I found myself a scrap piece of paper from my jar that I keep handy all the time for these sentiments, and I'm going to use my stamp positioner again, my Misty tool again, to stamp out the sentiment. I will be heat embossing this. I'm going to stamp this in black and then heat embossing with clear embossing powder because that's going to make the black look nice and glossy. So I'm conditioning the stamp again with my finger to make sure that I don't have any residue. I am treating that with the anti-static powder because I don't want any stray powder to remain on the sentiment. Of course, this is a white cardstock with clear embossing powder. It's not going to be that visible, but out of habit, I'm making sure that it is nice and that I get a nice and crisp embossing as well. And I'm just pressing it down lightly. I'm not putting too much pressure because the script is quite delicate and I don't want to squeeze and distort the sentiment. And I'm going to use the clear embossing powder which I store in this box, and I'm just going to dip it into the powder directly because it's so much easier that way. It's a narrow strip of paper and I have good coverage, and I am done with the clear embossing powder. And while I was at it, I thought that I'd use it again to heat emboss on the black cardstock with the same sentiments. And I'm going to use the Hero Arts white pigment ink here because I'll be using white embossing powder from Altenew, but I wanted to use the Hero Arts white pigment ink because it's just going to make the white look whiter on black. And yeah, with the white embossing powder, it's just going to look way better. And I do want that contrast so it doesn't look gray on the black cardstock. And although there's a lot of anti-static powder on the black cardstock, I'm going to show you in a bit when I'm done heat embossing how I clean it up so that it doesn't look gray anymore. I'm tapping off the excess and making sure that there's no stray white embossing powder around the sentiment, because once I melt it, the little bits and pieces of stray powder is just going to show up on the cardstock and it's not going to look nice. And I'm just funneling back the remaining powder into the jar, and I'm going to go off camera to my heating station and get it done. And here you are. I'm done with the heat embossing, and once the heat embossing has cooled down, I have brought my dry Swiffer cloth and rubbing off the anti-static powder. That's not going to work completely, but it takes off the first level. Then I bring in my microfiber rag and then my eraser to do the final touch up. And I'm using my eraser really lightly because I don't want to take out any of the heat embossing. So even though I'm kind of erasing in between the lines and things like that, but I'm doing it very, very lightly. And I have my puffy makeup brush to help with the cleanup. So the next step is to color the florals using the stencils. And I want a contrasting color with the blue background. So I'm going to use that set of inks. And primarily I'll be using ruby red and coral berry. So when the time comes for the leaves, I'm going to use the frayed leaf from that set as well. So it's coloring time now, and I'm going to use these stencils, color the flowers, and the stencils are numbered. So that is layer number 1, and they fit in perfectly with the outline. So I'm going to position my stencil very, very well. And I'm going to use some post-it notes to mask off the area that I don't want the ink to go into. And I'm starting with the ruby red for the petals of the flower. I'm going to start darker at the base and then kind of create an ombre effect with lighter areas at the top of the petals for the highlights. And I'll make sure that I retain some kind of light and shadow to give depth to the flowers. And anytime I'm in doubt, I always refer to the card at the back that gives me the diagram as well as ink suggestions and a sample image there, as well as the care instructions. So if you're in doubt, just check out the back of the stencil set. And then I'm lining up the second side. So there is an etching on that stencil, and it tells you A1 and A2, etc. So now that I'm done with the left side of the stencil, I'm coming into the design with the right side, and again I'm masking off all the areas that are exposed that I could accidentally blend my red ink into, and I don't want that. And I'm coming in with the same red because I don't like too much contrast on my flowers. These layering stencils are made so you can use different shades of the same color family or different colors. You know, it's your creative piece, so you know what to do best. But I like to keep to the same color, but I will use a light hand and a heavy hand depending on what parts of the flower I'm coloring. So I'm done with this entire layer of stencil. Now I'm coming in with the second stencil, which is stencil number 2, and the stem is on that side, on the right side, but I'm using the left side first. And while I was lining up this part of the stencil, I actually realized that I hadn't completed the flower entirely, and I still needed to use that first layer to color in that part of the buds. It's a tiny bud there, and it's on the first stencil, the first layer, which I had missed initially. So I brought back the first stencil and masked off the flower this time because I have to go in with the frayed leaf for the little bud there. So now I can finally call the first layer done and come back in with the second layer. I'm taking my time to line it up because you don't want the ink outside of the outline. And masking is important again because there are other openings. So I'm checking with the diagrams behind the stencil set to make sure that I'm doing it correctly. And this time I come in with the coral berry, and you see I am using the same brush, but I just took a scrap piece of paper and I am rubbing the ink off on that piece of paper because I've seen a lot of YouTubers rub it off on paper towel, etc. That ink is wasted. And again, I know I keep sounding like a broken record, but I like conserving my supplies, so I just brushed the blended that scrap piece of paper because I can use that scrap piece of paper later on for die cutting, maybe creating colored strips of cardstock from there, or using it as a background for a sentiment. It depends, right? I'd probably use it for die cutting flower petals, etc. So why waste that ink? So now I'm just finishing up those petals, the remaining petals, with the coral berry, and applying the same technique of going a little heavy at the base and then lightening up towards the top of the petals, and retain that light and shadow. And again, just brushing off the excess ink onto that scrap piece of paper. So now it's time to reveal what it looks like, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. I love the colors, and the coral berry and ruby red are so close together that it doesn't really show up as very stark contrast. And I'm trying to figure out the third stencil, and I realized there was a small piece of the petal there that I hadn't colored in, and I couldn't find it on the stencil. So I was wondering, and I took a look at the back of the stencil set and realized that it was part of the petal. And then I also noticed that the third layer of the stencil actually is for coloring the two smaller flowers. So I am done coloring the flowers. All I have left are the stems. And I'm again referring to the back of the stencil set to see which stencil it would be, and it was stencil number 2 that I had to go back to, and then I can now color in the stem. Again, lining up very, very carefully and tacking the stencil down onto the sticky mat just helps keep it in place, and then masking off again with the Post-it. I'm making sure that I don't go into the petals. I'm using the brown color here. It's called Paper Bag, and that's the darkest brown actually I have in my Altenew inks, and I am using that, but I realized that it was slightly reddish, but more of an orange, I would say, not red. And I wasn't sure that I really liked the contrast with the flowers. So while I'm blending, I thought that, I may have to mix inks right here. And you'll see me then come in with the green in a bit to darken up the stem. Yeah, I just wasn't happy with that orangey shade of brown. So I just thought I would put the stencil back in place and come in with the green, because since this is a reddish kind of orangish thing, and adding green would make it brown, which means that it's just going to end up being darker brown. And again, I'm practicing that same technique of smooshing some ink onto my glass mat and then using that, picking that up with my blending brush, because I don't want to contaminate the ink pad. And as I keep blending the green ink into the paper bag, the frayed leaf into the paper bag, I realized that it is looking brown now, and this is the perfect shade of brown that I wanted. But there's that little bit of white in between the stems, and since I don't have a cutting die for it, I was trying to figure out in my head what I would do with that little bit there, because I'm going to fussy cut this flower out in the absence of a die, of course, and I realized that little white piece may be a problem. So I won't bore you with half an hour of fussy cutting, because I hate fussy cutting, honestly, and it takes me a while. So I took it off camera and I completed the process. So here you are seeing me use the ergonomic snips from scrapbook.com. I will cut it out. I usually do a rough cut around the edges with that paper snip, and then I come in later with a fine detailed fussy cutting pair of scissors and I refine the edges. So after about 20 minutes of fussy cutting, I finally have the floral image cut out, but you can see that there are those white centers in between the stems, and obviously I couldn't cut them out, and I didn't want to risk cutting inside because I might end ruining that piece. And I also cut out a piece of vellum with that oval die to place on the card background, because the pattern is pretty bold, and if I use that, it's going to diffuse the background just a little bit to keep the attention on the floral image. And I also cut out the 2 sentiments with that little stitched rectangular die. And I love the glossiness and the shine from the heat embossing. So I have a choice of the black and the white sentiment, and I'll see which one looks best on the card. Okay, so let's get started assembling. I want to first figure out where to put the floral image. I definitely want it in the center, and I'm using my 2 magnets on my magnetic glass mat from Simon Says Stamp to help me position the elements and help me come up with the design. So obviously I can't use the entire flower, so I'm snipping off the smaller flower and keeping it. I'm conserving it because I'm going to use that on an envelope. And I'm flipping the pattern and checking to see which side the contrast looks better, and the lighter side on the top is the best. And here you see the fussy cutting, the detailed fussy cutting scissors I was talking about, and I'm again still finding rough edges which I'm refining as I go along. And now I'm going to start gluing everything down. This is a piece of press and seal paper, and this is a trick that I learned from Jennifer McGuire. She's an absolute genius at coming up with these hacks. You just use a bit of press and seal paper to adhere all the designs, and they all stay in place, right, when you push it down. And then I can come in with my liquid adhesive. I'm using Barely Art, and I'm going to kind of put down the glue where it's not exposed on the vellum, because vellum is translucent, and any glue, adhesive, anything I put behind it is going to show up on the front. So I am keeping the glue only to the floral image. That way there's no glue that's showing up through the vellum on the front. And I have some dimensional foam tape that I usually get from my closest dollar store, and I'm going to raise up the floral on the foam tape to give it some dimension. And the good thing about this dimensional foam tape is that since it's a roll, you can cut out as thick or as thin of a piece you like. And I'm going to put the foam tape all over the reverse side of the floral element, and I'm going to then put it down on the card when it's ready. And by the way, I have a separate pair of scissors that I use on foam tape and sticky stuff, because that way I don't get all the gunk onto other things. So I'm just kind of cutting out narrower strips of foam tape and adhering it to the back, because I realized that a bit of that foam tape was showing on the front of the element. I'm making sure every part of it is reinforced, so if this card goes through the mail, it doesn't get crushed. And I just peeled off the press and seal paper and it's perfectly lined up. Now it's time to place it on the card front. I'm making sure I know where I would like it, and I am now trying out the different sentiments, the white and the black, to see which one looks better. I did think initially that the black was very striking, but I thought it was maybe too much in my face. But then I realized that white wasn't really standing out, and it's all about the sentiment, right? So I'm kind of switching back and forth between the black and white, and then settle on the black, because that creates a really good contrast and pulls in the black from the outline of the stamped image. So now there was a bit of foam tape exposed, so that was getting stuck, but all's good. I just removed the backing paper from the foam tape and I'm going to adhere it to the card front. I use my tweezers because that way I can get my fat fingers out of the scene, and then I can see exactly what I'm doing and where, I'm placing the elements. So tweezers are always very handy. And now it's time for the sentiment. I am going to just glue it down right there on the top. I'm not using any dimension, any foam tape behind it on the card front, but in just a bit you'll see me sneak in some foam tape underneath that sentiment from behind the vellum, by the way. And yeah, there you see me take that piece of foam tape. I'll remove the backing paper and just tuck it underneath that sentiment strip under the vellum. That way that foam tape is invisible on the card front, but the sentiment is propped up and reinforced. And the card panel is ready. I decided not to add any further embellishments because I like the plain and simple look of it. And now it's time to place it on the card front, and because the panel is the exact same size as the card base, it's going to be fairly easy to just stick it down. And I am attaching the foam tape, like I'm using 3 strips of foam tape to cover the entire back of the panel. And I'm going to show you a quick trick on how I adhere the panel onto the card base without skewing it. I just remove half of the release paper, because when I place that on the card front, on the card base, the release papers basically act as springs and it doesn't get stuck down to the card base before I'm ready. And I'm just lining it up over here and sticking the top down. And now that it's in place, I can remove the remainder of the backing strips. And there was a bit that tore, so I removed that carefully, and it's done. I need to refine the smaller flower. I'm going to snip off that stem right there, and I have an A2 envelope that I'm going to embellish with that flower. So I have a beautiful set of a card and a matching envelope to go with it. Here I'm going to use the glue very sparingly because when I use wet glue, liquid glue on envelopes, I have noticed that the paper starts to warp and it looks ugly, especially because it's on the front of the envelope. So I use glue very sparingly. And another trick that you can do is apply the glue and let it sit for a minute or so. When it becomes tacky, it is not going to warp the paper. And there you go. I have a beautiful set of envelope and card ready to mail out to someone who needs a little pep up. And here are some still shots of the card that I just made, and I think it looks gorgeous with the contrast. So if you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and do subscribe to my channel and hit the notifications so you are notified when I post the next video. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next video.